What's up, guys? Welcome back. Okay, we are getting close. I finished waxing both of these patterns. I ended up putting 4 coats of mold release wax on each of them, so we're good to go there. And now we can move to the next and really final step of the detail and prep phase, and that is filleting. And once we're done with that, we'll be ready to pull molds. So in this video, I'll fillet both of these patterns, and along the way, we'll talk about what is filleting, why is it important, material options that are available to us, and recognizing that for a lot of people, filleting can be tedious and frustrating, especially for those that are new to the process or don't do it all that often. So I'll take you through some tools, techniques, tips and tricks that I've learned over the years that have really helped me make it a lot easier. Hopefully those will help make it easier, faster, and much more enjoyable for you. Let's dive in. Okay, what is filleting? Filleting is simply the process of adding material where 2 or more surfaces meet to ease what would otherwise be a sharp inside corner. And that little radius is important for a few different reasons. First, from a mold making perspective, fiberglass reinforcement like chop strand mat really doesn't want to cooperate a whole lot when it comes to inside corners. If you try to force fiberglass tightly into a sharp corner, it naturally wants to lift or bridge across it. And when that happens, it can trap air behind the reinforcement and create voids right where you really don't want them, along what will eventually become the outside edges of the mold. Now, those voids can leave you with weak edges, surface defects, and ultimately a mold that's much more prone to failure. By filleting the inside corners of the pattern, we give the fiberglass a smooth radius to follow. It's going to lay down more naturally, conform better to the geometry, and just gives us strong, solid outside edges in a finished mold that we can rely on to perform the way we expect it to. But there's another reason fillets matter beyond just making the fiberglass happy. Remember, our pattern represents the object that we ultimately want to create. So in this case, these inside edges in Catalyst will eventually become the inside edges of a concrete sink. And for a sink, sharp inside corners really aren't ideal. They're harder to clean, they can trap debris and water, and they just don't function or feel as nicely as a properly eased transition. A nice radius gives us a surface that's easier to clean. It's going to allow water to transition smoothly down the walls, drain properly, and ultimately produces a much more refined, finished piece. And the same thinking actually applies to the outside edges of this thing. So think about the front apron here. If we produce that with a perfectly sharp outside corner, not only would it be unpleasant to the touch, but that thin concrete edge is going to be very vulnerable to chipping, fracturing, and ultimately damage. So ideally, we want eased edges on both sides of the equation. Inside edges for cleanability, drainage, and function. Outside edges for durability, feel, and aesthetics. Now, in this case, Catalyst actually takes care of a lot of that for us. Because of the way the components are CNC fabricated and thermoformed, the fixed geometry already leaves these clean, crisp, radius transitions running front to back along the entire length of the profile. So our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to recreate those same kinds of transitions anywhere the system needs to remain adjustable and configurable. That means both sides and the transitions along the drainage plane. Once we get those areas filleted, this pattern is essentially finished and we're ready to pull molds. Okay, so we have a number of different options when it comes to filleting materials, and the right one really depends on what we're trying to accomplish. In some situations, it's actually desirable to create a fillet that's permanent. And I have a number of patterns that aren't adjustable or configurable in any way. They just are what they are. And for those, a permanent fillet makes perfect sense. Once the pattern's finished, whenever I want to pull another mold from it, there's really very little prep to do other than getting the surface ready for release. So in those situations, I typically reach for something that cures completely hard. Lots of options available here. There's commercially available putties designed specifically for filleting. You can also make your own bog using resin and fillers like Cabasil to thicken it to whatever consistency you need. Peanut butter is usually a good choice. And you'll even see people using fillers like Durham's Rock Hard Water Putty or body fillers like Bondo, though personally, that's not something I would really recommend that often. But whatever you use, just remember that these become permanent parts of the pattern surface. So they need to be properly finished, sanded smooth, sealed, and released. Otherwise, you run the risk of them bonding tenaciously to the gel coat and mold making materials. But in our case, permanent fillets would actually work against one of the biggest advantages of Catalyst. This system is designed to be adjustable and configurable. I want to be able to change the width, change the side angles, reposition components like the drainage plane, and then create an entirely different mold. So I don't want to permanently lock all those transitions together. What I want instead is a filling material that stays pliable, tools nicely, and holds its shape during the mold fabrication process, yet can easily be removed and replaced whenever I change the configuration. Now, those of you coming from precast world might naturally reach for silicone here. I get it, I did too. And when it comes to sealing and filleting precast forms, silicone is a fantastic material. Tools beautifully, stays flexible, and its very low surface energy is actually one of the reasons concrete releases from it so well. But that same characteristic can actually work against us when we move into composite mold fabrication. I learned this one the hard way. Early on, I tried using silicone to create fillets and patterns like these. It seemed like the obvious choice, but without fail, when I pulled the fiberglass mold, the edges that had been formed against the silicone would come out rough and jagged. Then I'd have to go back and sand, smooth, and basically reconstruct those edges before I could get the result that I wanted. That's a lot of unnecessary work. Eventually, I learned that a big part of the problem is silicone's extremely low surface energy. Gel coat wants to wet out and form a nice continuous film against the pattern surface, but silicone is notoriously difficult to wet out against. Instead of flowing cleanly against it, the gel coat tends to recoil, pull away, or just behave inconsistently right along that interface. And the result can be exactly what I was seeing: rough, irregular edges where I wanted a clean, crisp transition. So while silicone is still a fantastic choice for precast forms, and I use it all the time, it's not something I recommend for filleting patterns that we're going to pull composite molds from. The two processes might look similar, but they're not the same. Different process, different material. Now, this is where we reach for what many consider the industry standard for temporary filling: plasticine clay or wax-based modeling dough. Now, I got started years ago using plasticine clay, and honestly, it works great. It's inexpensive, readily available, pretty easy to find. Your composite supplier will definitely have it, your precast supplier may have it, and you can find it at arts and craft stores or even on Amazon. But in recent years, I switched to wax-based modeling dough. For me, it's just easier to work with. It applies easier, stays where I put it, tools beautifully, cleans up easier, and overall, I just find it better suited for this job. It can be a little bit harder to find. You'll probably need to source it through a specialty composite supplier, like Easy Composites, or you can try to find it directly. The specific product I use is called Pelican Nakiplast. And one little detail I really like about Nakiplast is that it's available in different colors. That might seem trivial, but I normally choose a color that contrasts with whatever gel coat I'm using. Now, my go-to gel coat is green, so ironically, I almost never use the green modeling dough. But Uni-Mould's tooling gel coat is black, so for this mold, we can actually break out the green. And once we start applying the gel coat, that contrast makes it really easy to spot any little areas where I might have missed coverage. Small detail, surprisingly useful. Now, the good news is whether you choose plasticine clay or wax-based modeling dough, everything I'm about to show you, the tools, techniques, tips, and tricks, applies equally well to both. So let's start filleting. Okay, first, let's talk about work surface. I like to have a clean, smooth surface dedicated to this task. Doesn't have to be this big, but I really like having a home base for everything I'm using. The modeling dough, tools, scraps, everything. Melamine works great. You can use laminate, HDPE, tile board, anything smooth and easy to clean. Hell, we could even use the test panel I made in an earlier video, another great use of a piece of FRP. Next, storage. I like to keep each color or type of material in its own dedicated container. Heavy-duty quart or gallon freezer bags work perfectly for this. One of the nice things about modeling dough is almost nothing goes to waste. All these little scraps and everything we scrape off as we're working can go right back into the bag and be reused on the next project. A block like this lasts a surprisingly long time. So once you open the original packaging, have somewhere to put it. Next, tools. You're also going to want at least a basic set of clay tools used for sculpting, carving, and shaping clay. Those will have everything you need: loop tools, wooden tools, double-sided with different profiles. Sometimes these will even include the ball tools. 10 to 15 bucks on Amazon or a local arts and crafts store, money well spent. Okay, a couple more tools that are super handy to have. First, these body filler spreaders. These are super handy to have for all kinds of tasks, but when it comes to filleting, you'll typically get your material in blocks or bricks like this. And one of the first tasks will be to chop that down into more usable strips. A body filler spreader, especially the large one, is like the perfect size for chopping these things down just like slices of cheese. So we'll come back to this when we go through the demonstration, but body filler spreaders, really handy to have. And then we'll also go through this a little bit more detail as we get into the demonstration, but the material loves heat. It really becomes more workable when it's in a warm ambient temperature. And the same goes for the tools. So a plumber's torch is really handy to just quickly heat your tools. You don't have to go crazy on it, but just heat your tool up a little bit, and then it will literally slice through that modeling dough like a hot knife through butter. So good tool to have as well. And again, we'll go through this when we go through the demonstration. Okay, so let's just clear up a little space here. We're gonna go ahead and use the green, as I mentioned, for this one. And then we'll start by filleting just this test piece here. And so let's take our block of modeling dough, and I could also use these excess strips or these excess pieces, but I'll take the block and simulate like using a new block. And again, the first thing I do is chop off some slices of cheese from this. And again, this body filler spreader makes that super easy. So just a couple will do just fine. Slice through it like that. And then the next thing we'll do is lay them flat and slice through them again. And the size that you slice these in, you'll figure out what works best for you depending on the size fillets that you do. Something around 1/4 inch usually works fine for me. All right, and now I've got basically these square profiled strips that are much more convenient to work with. And then the next thing I want to do is roll those into beads. Rolling those into beads will not only compact the material, but it's going to make it much easier to place and press inside our edge that we want to fillet. It's also worth mentioning that there are commercially available clay extruders where you take the modeling dough or clay, fill it into an empty tube similar to a caulk tube, and then squeeze the trigger and press that material through a die. So in our case, it'd be a round shaped die, and that will produce round shaped beads of modeling dough. And they work great, but unless you're doing really large projects like boats or something like that, I don't actually think it's all that worth it. But the technique I'm about to show you right now is super simple and works great for the typical projects that we're working on. So rather than using a clay extruder like that, I found it's easy enough to just take a small rip of melamine or a laminate and then use that as a roller, almost like a rolling pin for rolling out dough. So take one of your strips, and you might need to roll it with your hands first just to take the little edges off, but then you can take your rolling pin, your melamine strip, and roll back and forth, and that will turn that into a nice round bead that we can use. And again, you don't need to press too hard on this. In fact, if you press down too hard, you're gonna squish the modeling dough and it'll actually stick to your work surface and your rolling pin. So just gently roll it back and forth and let that take shape. And that's pretty much perfect right there. So then once we have these, and I can roll out a few of these, and a quick note here, we don't have to create beads to cover the entire length of all of our edges. And you're gonna see why as we go through the demonstration, but we'll create a lot of excess as part of the tooling process. That excess will actually work perfectly for subsequent areas of filleting. So just a few pieces of modeling dough to get started, and then we'll work our way along. Okay, so the next thing I wanna do is press this into my inside edge. And I'm gonna actually take a little bit off this on purpose to demonstrate a couple of the different benefits of working with modeling dough. So I'll go ahead and lay that in there. And then what we wanna do is press that firmly into that edge. And the reason we wanna do this is because another one of the sources of frustration when we go to tool and the material sort of tearing out is, quite frankly, is that the material is just laying over the edge and there's a gap behind that. And so then when you go to tool it, it naturally is gonna tear out because it's not firmly placed in there. So I like to work that in really well with my fingers, almost pushing it back onto itself. And then oftentimes that'll be good enough, especially for working in warm ambient temperatures. But if I want to really be sure, I'll take the backside of one of my wooden tools that's kind of spoon shaped like this, and I'll use that to really compact the material in like that. We're not going for a perfect radius right now, so don't worry about that. We just want to make sure it's really compacted in there so that when we go to tool it, it will basically stay in place, okay? And it's worth mentioning here that I alluded to this earlier, but this material really loves heat. It becomes much more workable in warmer ambient temperatures. And right now it's summer in California and the ambient temperature is almost perfect. In fact, if anything, it's a little bit warm inside my shop. So I don't have any worries there. The material works great. But if it's colder, it's in the colder months, I might take it outside if it's sunny to let the sun warm it up, or place it in front of a heater. I might even work it with my hands a little bit just to warm the material slightly to make it easier to work with. Because that's another sort of source of frustration around the workability of the material. Really, it can often trace back to the fact that it's just too cold, and so it's gonna kind of fight you a little bit. Warm it up a little bit, you'll find it's probably a lot more workable. Okay, now that we've got that mashed in there, now's the time we wanna actually tool and shape the material into that radius, that nice consistent radius that we're looking for. Now, if you're coming from precast, again, your instincts might be to reach for a ball tool here. And that might work just fine, especially in warmer ambient temperatures. But instead, I would really recommend reaching for a loop tool first. And this is pretty much my go-to right here. And the reason for that is you might get a ball tool to work, but unlike silicone, where you're just shaping it, it has very little resistance. This fillet right here that's roughed in, there's a lot more material there. It gives you a lot more resistance. And so when you try to plow through that directly, more often than not, it's gonna fight you, and that's what's gonna cause it to tear out, because the material loves to stick to itself, and there's basically just too much here to work through with a ball tool. So instead, what I recommend is first reaching for a loop tool, and you might find this is actually all you need, but at a minimum, what that will do is help you hog out that excess and kind of reveal the radius, and then you can come back with a ball tool and clean that up and tighten it up, okay? So the technique with a loop tool is really simple. It's just kind of press it into one side, and then I like to pull toward me rather than push, and that just carved our radius right there. Now, again, don't just ball up or dispose of this excess. This is actually perfect for our next section of filleting. Keep it just the way it is and set it back on your work surface. And that's another reason I like a large, clean work surface, because I can also gather the scraps that I've carved off and use those as I continue filleting. Okay, and so that left us actually a really nice radius right there. Of course, we've got the debris on each side of our radius to clean up there, and I'm going to show you some tips for that as well. And then on purpose, I actually filleted just a little bit short here to show you another benefit of clay or modeling dough is that it's very forgiving to come back and add more to it when you need to. You might be a little bit short in some areas, or take some away. You can continue to refine it and get it as perfect as you want it to be. Whereas with silicone, it's not as easy to do that. You can fill it in, but once it starts to cure even a little bit, you can pretty much forget about it. You're not gonna be able to add any more on, clean it up, refine it in any way. So what I found, at least with silicone, is when you get all of your silicone out there, tool it, clean it up in one shot, you pretty much let it set from there. So in this case, I came up a little bit short, so I'm just gonna take a small piece of additional modeling dough, press that into my edge. I like to overlap it a little bit in these situations like this, and then I'll come back with my loop tool and radius that. Now, when I'm close to an end like this, what I like to do is start from the end and then work my way in rather than the other way out, because that'll also tend to tear out a little bit. So I just press in here at this end, tool that like that, and I might even feather it up a little bit, right? So it just teared out just a little bit on that end, but you get the idea. You can get a really clean finished radius with just the loop tool. Now, I will also show coming back and coming over that with the ball tool in just a second, but let's first clean up all this residual, because this is another source of frustration for a lot of folks. It can be pretty tedious cleaning up kind of that residual modeling dough that's left on each side of our tooling. So here's a simple trick for handling that. You will hear folks say, oh, take some material, ball it up a little bit, and then use that because it loves to stick to itself, and use that to clean it up. And that can work, but that's not nearly as efficient as what I'm about to show you. Instead, what you want to do is take one of your wooden tools that has a radius on it that's just a little bit bigger than the radius of the loop tool that you just used, okay? So I've got a couple here, and this is one that comes with the clay tool set. This is just a tongue depressor, right? And it's good to have a pack of these popsicle sticks because you can customize those to all kinds of handy shapes. But this is just a tongue depressor with its sort of standard radius, and you'll see that its radius is, it's actually quite a bit bigger than the loop tool. But then the idea with that is that I can use this to scrape that excess there, and I know that it's not going to disturb my finished radius because the radius of this is too big to fit in there. So I can go after that pretty aggressively, clean all that excess off there, and in just a couple of scrapes, without even trying very hard, I've got most of the residual off there. And the only reason I don't have this part cleaned up is because that radius was too big. So I've also got a tool that's a little bit closer, that's still bigger than the loop tool, but a little bit closer in radius. And so I can bring that in there to finish that off. And now I've got almost a perfectly clean radius fillet in my inside edge there. From there, I could then just take a paper towel or a cloth, but I want to be able to fill it and just wrap it around my finger. My finger is also going to be bigger than the radius there. And so I can just very gently wipe like that, and that'll clean off any of that extra excess that might still be there on those sides. And you've basically got a perfect radius fillet right there, okay? So a couple of quick tips there. And then again, take some liberties and make some handy tools with basic tongue depressors and popsicle sticks. The radius on these might be just fine. I often chop them into really sharp sort of knives that I can get in and scrape really, like that one. You can shape these on the belt sander, use a razor blade, all kinds of ways to get yourself some really handy tools. Okay, so now let's come back and actually tighten this radius up a little bit more. I mentioned that in most cases, the loop tool is good enough for me. That will leave me a radius that I actually want. But there might be some situations where I want to come back over that with a ball tool. One of the things that's important with a loop tool is that you maintain a consistent orientation to the workpiece. What will happen otherwise is if you're tilting it this way or this way, it'll change the radius of the tool, and then that will make your radius of your fillet kind of wavy and inconsistent, okay? But with practice, you'll probably get that to be just fine. But another way you can remedy that is with a ball tool, because a ball, by definition, there's a sphere there, and it doesn't matter what the orientation is. Assuming it's a perfect sphere or close enough to a perfect sphere, you can change the angle of that to whatever you want, and it's still going to leave the same radius on your finished fillet, okay? So what I like to do in those cases is I will take one of the ball tools that's just a little bit smaller than the radius of my loop tool, and I'll finish it off with this. And now, because I've done the loop tool first, it's carved and hogged away the majority of that excess material, and it'll be a lot easier to use this. That being said, if I feel it's going to be a little stubborn or I want to make sure that I get through it, here's where I might use a plumber's torch. And the idea is really simple. I'm going to heat this up a little bit to make sure I get through that easily. So just heat your plumber's torch, turn it down. We don't need to go crazy here. Just wave it over that a couple of times. And one of the visual cues you'll see is it'll get really shiny. That's when you know it's warm enough. Okay, so just a little wave like that. And then I can take that tool through this, and it'll perfectly tool that radius with that smaller roundover, and I'm left with a perfect radius there. I've got a little bit of debris to take care of there, but same exercise. Take a wooden tool with a radius that's just a little bit bigger than that, and use that to clean up that excess. And there's a perfect radius fillet right there. Okay, pretty trivial example here, but this technique will serve you well in much longer spans or when you're trying to tool and shape curves or around more complicated geometry. A very typical example is a three-way corner. And this is something that you're going to run into all the time, and the technique using the ball tool can really help make this easy as well. So I'll just go ahead and add another piece of melamine here to cap this off. And this will, again, mock up what is a typical three-way corner. Fill and tool the edges just like before. Remember that piece of excess carved filleting material that was left over from the prior fillet? I'm going to go ahead and now use that in these areas. So I'll just fill that in there. I need a little bit more to finish this edge off right here. And again, make sure I get it good and pressed in there. I'll come back with my spoon tool to once again make sure it's really compacted. And then now I'll use my loop tool to hog that out, and then the ball tool to clean everything up, but we'll use a special trick in that inside corner. When I've got a situation like this, I like to actually attack this from both sides. So I'll start on the ends because, again, those are going to be prone to tear out. And I'll first just come in a little bit there like that and back out. Okay, so that part is carved. Same thing here. Just carve it a little bit and then back it out. And then I'll go into the corner and come out of the corner. But then when I reach here, it's not going to tear out. So I'll go ahead and go right into the corner there, press in and carve. And now we've got a very nice finished fillet there all the way to the edge. Same thing here. I'll go ahead and press in, pull out. And sometimes I'll even use my thumb right there to make sure that it doesn't tear out at that very last part of where that end is. Okay? And again, with practice, you can probably get it pretty close to where you want it on that inside corner with just the loop tool by progressively getting in closer and just watching your orientation of the tool. But here's where a ball tool can work a little magic for us. It almost acts like a cheat code. So once I've hogged out all that excess with the loop tool, now I'm going to come back over everything with the ball tool. Okay, so I'll come over this edge right here, clean that up real nicely, come over this edge right here, clean that up real nicely. And then what I'm going to do is make sure I take all of the residual off of the ball, and I'm going to drive it right into that corner, press, and I'm just going to rotate the ball a little bit and feather that out. Okay, so I'm going to press right into that corner, rotate a little bit, come out of the corner like that, into the corner, rotate, come out like that. And now we've got a perfect set of fillets. Once I clean that up, that'll leave us with a perfect inside corner. Okay, once we're done with that and have all of our fillets perfected, it's time for cleanup. And a couple of tips and tricks here. First, as I mentioned, gather all of your excess and you can either stack it back onto the brick or ball it up and store it all back in that baggie. So in this case, I'm just going to take these strips and just press those and stack them right back onto my block. And then I've got this little bit of residual here. And here's where the modeling dough that likes to stick to itself will really work to your advantage. Just take a little bit of a ball and you can pick up the rest of it just like that. Clean up all your excess, ball that up, okay? And then you can take your block and the extra balled up stuff, store that back in your baggie, and that's ready for your next filleting session. Now you'll still have some residual on your tools to clean up, so you can use the tools to help clean one another up. So for example, I might take the sharp pointy edges of these wooden tools to clean up the residual that's inside the loop tool right there, okay? And then same thing with the ball tools, not much on there, but I can work that off and then get this final little excess off of here. And then I can store that in the baggie as well. Seal that up. And again, it's ready for my next filleting session. And so again, working off of a clean surface really helps us eliminate getting any unwanted debris from getting stuck back in our leftover modeling dough. Next, the work surface and the rolling pin are also going to have a bit of a film on them. So we can scrape that off a little bit with our body filler tool. And anything that's left over there, if it's worth saving, go ahead and throw that back into the baggie as well. And then after that, there will still be a sticky residual film, and Goo Gone is going to be our cheat code here. All we need is just a little bit, either on the surface or onto a rag. Quick wipe of that, and it's literally like magic. That sticky residual film will pretty much vanish for us. And same thing, you can clean the tools off with that, and all of your tools, your work surface, everything will be clean and ready to go again. Now you'll have that oily film from the Goo-Gone. So what I like to do to take care of that is just to bring it back to neutral with some simple green. Again, just a little bit is all you need. Spray a paper towel, the surface, wipe that down, and that'll take all of that oily residual away and get us back to a completely neutral surface where we're ready to roll again. Hopefully that was helpful. I know I went into a fair amount of detail when it comes to filleting, but I also know that it's a big source of frustration for a lot of folks. So hopefully a few of these techniques, tips, and tricks that I've shared with you will help make it easier, faster, and just a more enjoyable experience. Thanks so much for watching. Keep taking those creations to the next level, and feel free to follow along, because after I get done filleting both of these patterns, we'll be ready to pull some molds. All right, these patterns are waxed, filleted, detailed, prepped, and ready to roll. I'm super stoked to dive into the Uni-Mould tooling system, and these patterns are perfect for it. Hopefully you took something away from this. If you have any questions, comments, tips or tricks of your own, hit me up in the comments, shoot me a DM. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much for watching. Keep taking those creations to the next level and stay tuned. Next up, pulling some molds.